Without further ado, this is Sue Collins sitting with me right here, and I'm Lisa Cooper, and we are going to be your presenters today. Sue and I both have extensive experience consulting on the design and execution of legal claim substantiation research. And the way that we describe this kind of research is the simplest, most complicated research you'll ever design and or do. When we receive calls from our clients about designing legal claims research, the first thing we find ourselves doing is kind of explaining how this is very different than any other kind of research that we do. And I think by the time we finish this webinar today, you'll understand why. Of course, all the standard research best practices apply, but the level of detail that goes into the decision-making, the execution, quality control, record-keeping is just far more rigorous. And again, I think you'll see why once we get into the meat.
This is Sue Collins. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Lisa, for opening this up. There are at least 4 things that we will try to impart knowledge to you today on regarding claim substantiation, the different types of consumer claims, how consumer research is used to support a claim, the different requirements and potential pitfalls doing this research, and also throughout you'll get a sense of thinking about what happens if your claim is challenged, or further if you wanted to challenge someone else's claim. So let's dive right in and talk about the definition of a claim. A claim can simply be the promise of a benefit to a consumer, and it can be taking the form of a direct promise or an implied promise. It also can be verbal or visual, and that's why it's very important as you're discussing preliminarily doing claim substantiation that you have a really good idea of not only what you want to say in the claim, but what you want to, how you want to depict it. So that's very important, and oftentimes people don't know that, and really until you have that information, you don't have the foundation of the test. So that's really important. So why do marketers make claims? I'm sure you can imagine some of the reasons why. It's really to help communicate the unique value of your brand and complement your brand story. So you could be illustrating absolute benefits of your product. You could be discussing or showing a change in your product, or very likely you could be sharing an advantage over a competitor. Utilizing claims most often occurs when a company needs to create news in the marketplace. That's a really big one. Also occurs when your company is trying to bootstrap itself up or level the playing field against a market leader. You could also be strongly communicating a relative value that perhaps you and your marketing team don't feel is effectively being communicated. It could be anything from having a real ingredient to having more of an ingredient, to having some kind of health benefit, so on and so forth.
And yeah, so I'm going to pop in here just kind of give color commentary and say that while you and I have done a lot of this over the years, a lot of claims work, we definitely have seen a marked increase in marketers wanting to make claims to consumers. Certainly since 2008, when we saw the financial drop, and obviously there's 2 reasons for that, because consumers had less money in their pockets to spend. Therefore, marketers are more strongly, trying to get a share of that wallet. So with all the space being taken up by so many products out there, what can you do to make yourself stand out from the crowd? Often it's a claim. So we're going to start out kind of with the exception to the rule. The question is, do all consumer claims require substantiation? And the answer is no. We're going to spend most of today talking about the yeses, but for a second, let's just talk about that no. What kinds of claims do not require substantiation? Well, we have a word for this, and it's called puffery. The non-legal definition of puffery is exaggerated praise, which is kind of similar to the legal definitions, if you will. So puffery from a legal perspective might be what you call exaggerated blustering. So our product is the greatest. I think a lot of, and we'll talk about this as we go through, a lot of the basis for doing legal claim substantiation is based on what consumers might or might not take away from your advertising. And the idea here is that the average consumer or the general consumer would pretty much know that this was blustering, that it didn't necessarily have concrete evidence backing it up. Another example is what we call a commonly accepted truth. So if you're saying that a cold beverage is refreshing, carbonated soft drink, for instance, if you want to say your carbonated soft drink is refreshing, that all carbonated soft drinks, all cold things are known to be refreshing. Warm things are known to be comforting. So again, you may not need to substantiate that kind of a claim. And finally, many people. So many people love our product. It's kind of just general enough that you're not saying X percent or many people love our product. Now, if you said many people love our product more than something else, then we're getting into different territory, which we're going to get into in a moment. But again, just these kind of general pie in the sky things can be assumed to be puffery.
So Lisa, like you were saying, the many people statement, if one word change in that statement or claim could make the difference on not being puffery and potentially have a big challenge on your hands. So that's, many people is very different than the majority of people. It's certainly very different than all people. So that's a lot of the discussion that goes on with claims testing is what are we going to say and how are we going to support it, as well as what's meaningful, and we'll be addressing that as well. So we're going to talk about the kinds of claims that require substantiation, and they generally fall into three different buckets. The first is comparative claims, and that could be against a new version of yourself, or it can be a competitive comparison. And we'll be spending a lot of time on this because this is the one that usually has the most high risk. Non-comparative claims is just an assertion that your product has a specific benefit. And market performance claims or scientific claims, they may require substantiation of a sort, but not necessarily of the consumer variety. So with comparative claims, you're very used to the big market share leaders going head-to-head, and you're looking for, let's say in the cola wars, for one brand to be superior over the other. And talk about high stakes. This is really high stakes. But what we're also seeing nowadays is even the smaller brands are going head-to-head. And you're also having cases where you might be a smaller brand, lower market share, and you're going against the big guy. So high stakes again. And because there's a lot of business and money at stake, these are the claims that are most likely to be challenged. Now, there are other kinds of comparative claims that we're really not going to spend too much time on. In some ways, they're more complicated in a different way. These are the kinds of comparative claims that are looking for parity or equality. There may be situations where you know you can't get superiority, but you want to get parity so you can kind of bootstrap yourself up to the market leader. And one type is an identical claim where you're saying, for example, that you can't taste the difference versus fresh squeeze. You're basically identical. The next one would be generally similar, where you're saying you taste like butter, as an example. And again, you want to be very careful. One word could be very different. Taste like butter is totally different than saying taste just like butter. And the final type is what's called equally acceptable, where you're saying taste as good as the leading brand. And then that gets into a whole territory of what is the leading brand, what would consumers think about what's the leading brand, and the kind of discovery that your team would go under to figure that out. What do we need to test against? So if we focus more on comparative claims versus yourself, many of them are new and improved, and that's the widely used one. The new is very easy. You make a change in your formula, it is new. The part that comes after the ampersand is usually the part you're really trying to substantiate. If you're going to add that on, is it improved something? Is it more of something? And so forth. And you're thinking you're going to do this because you want to create some news without ever introducing some competitive element. But you want to make sure that to the consumers, this is something that would really be compelling to them. You know, there could be some downsides for saying that you've made a change or being specific about the change, because loyal consumers don't like it when you change your brand, and that's called franchise risk. Or some people may be questioning, including the press, including the competition, well, wait a minute, if their taste is improved, what have I been buying or liking all along?
Yeah, and two things I was going to add to that. Number one is that there are some additional things to think about when you're doing this type of claim. Number one is that there are some time limits on how long you can keep a new and improved claim on your packaging. Also, if you're comparing this new and improved to your current has to have been on the market for a certain period of time to even be considered a current against which you are benchmarking yourself. So these are the kinds of things that maybe people on the team are not necessarily aware of, and the kinds of discussions that Sue and I have with people every day. All right, so I'm going to pick it up from here and change gears onto non-comparative claims. So everything Sue just talked about is comparing ourselves to something, even if it's just ourselves. These are non-comparative claims, and they are used to communicate to consumers, again, that your product has some desirable attribute. I have a little test here, and you don't have to answer, obviously, out loud, but answer in your head, if you will. 3 of these claims that you see in front of you are clearly non-comparative. One of them could be argued to be comparative, actually. I'll give you a second to think about that, and then I'll say that the 3 that are non-comparative clearly are creamy texture, rich and filling, and gives you energy. But if I'm saying that my product has fresh brewed taste, one might argue that, in fact, I'm comparing myself to something. I'm comparing myself to fresh brewed tea or coffee or whatever the product might be. And so, again, I think we're just trying to kind of throw these things in here to show you that one word matters, intent matters, execution matters. There's so many elements to this, and that's why we spend a lot of time with the teams up front talking about what it is that they would like to say. So that's non-comparative. Next is market performance claims. Now, this is one of those that falls into the area that Sue was talking about earlier, where we do not necessarily need consumer substantiation for this. So if I'm saying that my product is America's #1 product, it might be that I'm talking about popularity. I'm talking about sales. It's the #1 selling product. It's used in more homes than other products. That is substantiation by secondary data. If you're saying it's #1 taste, that's different. That's a consumer perception, and so you would have to do consumer claims. But a pure market performance claim is basically a fact-based, and it's supported by sales data or by some other acceptable industry source of measurement. And the other type of claim that we talked about was fact or science-based claims. So a nutrient-based claim, for instance, might be now with 50% more calcium. R&D people can prove that this new formulation actually has 50% more calcium. We would suggest, however, that if you had something like now with 50% more calcium on your packaging, you caveat that 50% more than what? Is it 50% more than your previous formulation? Or is it 50% more than your competitor? Because in terms of challenging, and we said we'd kind of pepper throughout the discussion here challenges, in terms of challenging a claim, a competitor might look at this claim, and they don't have to do a product test of any kind to challenge a claim. A competitor could actually do what we call a communications test. They could go out to consumers, they could show them your package, they could show them your package with this claim on it and say to consumers, what does this mean to you? What do you think this means? What do you think they're telling you? It's kind of an open-ended probing process. And if there's a kind of a benchmark in terms of if X number of people say, oh, I think they mean it has 50% more calcium than the leading brand, then even if that's not what you intended, that competitor has a legitimate basis for a challenge to your claim. So being specific is very important. A health-related claim, helping reduce the risk of heart attack, etc. Again, you theoretically have some other science-based support for that. I think that probably gets you into the area of the FDA, which is beyond the scope of legal claim substantiation, but there are other hurdles that you have to pass over.
And while you're speaking, Lisa, here's our first question from our attendees, wanting to know specifically more about how to handle some of these science or fact-based claims. Well, when would you do substantiation research among consumers? So here's an example. If you had something now with more chocolate than before, so you're just talking about your own formulation, not anybody else's, that might be a fact, and 50% could be a lot more certainly. But your team might say, you know what, let's go out there. Let's pretend it wasn't 50% more. Let's pretend that you're saying now with more, but you're not saying how much because you don't want to say for whatever reason, but formula security or something like that. And you want to make sure before you make the claim that consumers really feel it when they taste it. So that would be a case where you're kind of giving yourself protection that you're not going to hurt yourself by going out there with the true fact and people not feel it. Now, if you found out that people don't feel it, so to speak, don't taste it, don't recognize it, you may or may not make the claim. You may, because in general that would be a quality improvement, and you may not want to go ahead and spend the money and capital on that. So now you discussed with your team what you want to do, let's say, and you have the kind of claim in mind and how you're going to potentially depict it in what venues, print, TV, what have you. What do you do next? Well, what we like to say is it takes a village. We try and get the cross-functional team within the organization together, at least on a kickoff, and then throughout the discussion to include the major stakeholders. And they're obviously going to be the insights team, the marketing players, R&D, and certainly legal comes into play. And in fact, it's not uncommon for Lisa and myself to say throughout a discussion on the upfront part of designing these tests, this is what we think and here's why, but we strongly suggest you discuss it with legal. Because, they're the lawyers. They're the ones that ultimately are going to have to help defend if you're challenged, whether it goes to court or not. Just having a challenge is a big pain in the neck. So they may know something or have some precedent, whether it's research-based or something else, where they can weigh in and should weigh in. And then throughout the whole designing and discussion, the different stakeholders would continue to be involved, from everything to equipment to different questionnaire inputs and things of that nature. So the job of the team together is to make sure we're aligning on what the desired claim will be and how it's going to be executed in marketing materials. Now, you might be surprised, and whenever I say that, everyone laughs, that many times people are not aligned on this. Not only aren't they aligned, they haven't discussed it, so one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing. They thought the test started, they thought it would take less time. Oh, I thought we were claiming this, but we're out in the field and we have a totally different question that would never support or substantiate that claim. So it's really important when you're going to undertake something potentially high risk, particularly versus a big market share leader, and you're going to spend the time, considerable dollars on claim substantiation, everybody is aligned, and the claim, what you're going to want to do with the results is known at the outset, and we can't stress that more. Okay? So let's talk about the hallmarks of good consumer claim substantiation research. First and foremost, we want to design a fair and balanced research test. And Lisa may have alluded to this at the beginning regarding the rigor of these tests. While the basic components are similar to any well-designed, well-executed, quality-focused test, the rigor is so much more. You don't want to give any kind of impression that you absolutely gave yourself an advantage, particularly versus a competitor if it's a comparative situation, or that there's an impression that you gave yourself an advantage, which could come through, again, if somebody challenges you and doing it because they've done communications testing where the average consumer actually had a different takeaway than what you intended. So you want to make sure that it's fair and balanced and you execute with the greatest attention to detail and quality control. And that's why someone like Lisa and myself are going to be somewhat of hound dogs to make sure really every T is crossed and every I is dotted. So with that in mind, we design and execute with the expectation of a challenge, a little bit like playing devil's advocate. And we might be expecting war, but we hope it doesn't occur. So we attempt at every step in the course of the project to sit in the competitor's shoes and really think about how would they attack the research and how would we defend it. So again, that's taking on the devil's advocate role. And we think about all the different design elements that have to be considered along the process. Lisa?
All right, so Sue stole my devil. I was going to say the devil is in the details. And these are just some of the details, and there's a world underneath each of these things. We're going to kind of go through some of them, not to kind of expect that you're going to walk out of here and be able to answer every question having to do with each of these things. I think it's more to give you a sense of the breadth of detail that needs attending to, the kinds of questions that you might ask so that it makes you a better partner when you're dealing with this type of research. So, as we said earlier, this kind of maps back to that simple, complicated research. And the place we want to start is talking about who we should test amongst. So on the left-hand side, you see that in typical research and traditional research endeavors, we're often focused on gathering information about our target market, right? So it's either our brand users or some demographic or psychographic segment of the marketplace, or people who we're trying to reach, maybe our target audience who's not necessarily currently a user. But when we're doing legal claim substantiation, the opposite is kind of true. The rule of thumb we always say is you should include the broadest relevant target. So this is one that takes a lot of conversation with the team often. General parameters, I would say, is that you should be talking to category users, so not just users of your brand. An exception to that would be if your claim is among your brand users, if you say my brand users prefer me, or if your claim is among your competitors' brand users, you might say our competitors' users actually prefer us. Those are specific circumstances, but if you're not making those very specific claims, then you want to make sure that your sample definition is quite broad. Within that, you certainly want to properly represent users of your brand and any competitive brands, and also properly represent key demographic groups, geographies, etc.
Lisa, here's another question from one of the attendees, and could you clarify a little bit more about target marketing and what if there's a certain subsegment of the category we're trying to reach? Well, for regular marketing plans and development, that's all well and fine, and that makes sense. The courts more recognize broader samples, and part of that is that they're saying, you know what, your advertising and messaging, many more people than your target, your desired target, could be reached and be influenced, and that's why broader is better. So, there's some wiggle room around that. But it's something definitely you want to talk about, and again, there is a lot of discussion on that. We have something going on now where, one word on how we're going to define the people has been going on with the team and legal for about a week. And we think we'll get there, but they really need to weigh in with legal on are we going to go broader and take our recommendation or not.
And believe it or not, we actually enjoy this, Sue and I. So another kind of thing to think about is that intended execution matters, and I know we kind of hinted at this a couple of times previously. So a good example is if you say that your target for your product is adults, and you determine to set your sample as adults in the category, and then marketing says, oh wow, we have our ad, we know that we want to show this family eating the product. Wow, that changes everything, because it doesn't only matter who your target is, again, in a very different way, it matters how you're going to execute against this. If you are showing a family eating the product, then, again, if you did some communications research, the general consumer might think that you're inferring that it's a all family product and that all the family prefers or likes or agrees with your claim assertion. So execution matters.
So along with knowing about your execution intentions ahead of time, as well as the claim itself, there's a lot of discussion regarding the sample size. There are some general guidance on recognized standards regarding sample size. Generally speaking, 300 is required for comparative tests when you're looking for superiority. That's felt to be a sound number, and that's the number that's been used for dare I say, ages. You actually need more when you're looking for parity, and usually that's 500. And we won't bore you with the details, but it's related to stats where it's actually easier to obtain parity with a smaller sample size. You do a larger sample size so it doesn't look like you gave yourself an advantage. Now, the sample size is more of an open discussion point when you're doing a comparative claim versus yourself. You really need to think about the risk tolerance. In years past, it was felt that perhaps if you're just doing a claim against yourself, an improvement, or now with, or people feel this way about you, that nobody was going to bother you. But as Lisa talked much earlier in the discussion about today being a much more competitive marketplace for lots of reasons, now we're finding that competitors are actually looking at their competition's advertising on a regular basis, not only to learn what they're saying, who they're trying to track, but trying to scour to see, are they saying something that we want to challenge, even if it's just about themselves.
Yeah. So one thing I want to add to that, Sue, and then actually we just had a question pop up. I wanted to say I've actually done, and the question actually links back to this nicely, I've done tests where I've done a sample size of 1,000, and that's all about kind of show, if you will, right? That's to say we are just erasing any possibility that someone could question the veracity of our claim. So the question, interestingly, is, could you give an example of when you might want to use a larger sample size for a superiority claim? And I would say that if you had a desired claim, like 4 out of 5 accountants recommend brand A software over brand B software, you might want to think about, because software, again, is a very competitive environment, doing a higher sample size than 300. 300 is, I would say, the minimum acceptable. It's certainly acceptable, but if you want to proactively go out there and say, hey, you know what, we've done 500 interviews, we've done 1,000 interviews, much less likely. They've got a lot more armor on you that way.
Exactly. So we know what our claim is, we know how we're going to, or what we want to achieve. We know how we're going to depict it. We know how many people we're going to do it among. We know what our definition is now.
Oh, can I stop one? Because I have one more thought about that, and this is interesting too, is Sue and I attend conferences with the NAD, which we'll talk about a little later, the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau, which is one of the governing bodies, someone who you might go to if you were going to challenge a claim. Excuse me. And in recent years, in the past, let me start with, in the past, it used to be that the NAD sat back passively and they waited for you to come in and challenge your competitor's claim, or for your competitor to come in and challenge you. In recent years, we've heard the NAD saying, hey, you know what, we're consumers as well, and we sit around and watch TV and we buy products and have them on our shelves, and if we see a claim that we kind of question whether somebody had substantiation for, the NAD, which is a board of lawyers actually, is now bringing these cases to themselves. So it's not even that your competitor has to challenge you. It could be the NAD looking into it proactively. That's interesting.
Yeah, and and one other thing we know about social media, it made me think of this, with things going viral. You've got sort of watchdog moms and watchdog consumers who have various agendas, and it may include just making money on their website, but where they'll go after companies as well, and then companies have to pull advertising, etc.
Yep.
So we have all this behind us now, and we have to talk about where we're going to do the studies. Again, here's another point about geographic that does take a considerable amount of time. There's strong preference the test to be done in central location facilities, and the main reason is for control. And the number of markets and the geo-dispersion is going to depend on many factors. First and foremost, it's going to depend on what your claim is and where the brands exist. So for example, if you wanted to say that Chicago loves your brand, or loves your brand better than the other brand, you're obviously not going to test in other areas than Chicago. It's irrelevant. Likewise, if you go into a test doing full geo-dispersion across the country, and for somehow you get your hands on the data and you want to say, oh, let's look at the Chicago market, oh, we got to win there too, that's usually not going to fly because you're not going to have enough people to substantiate it. That gets back again to knowing exactly what you want to do with the data before you say go. Typically in consumer research, we would look at brand and category development indices to understand where we're going, that we have good representation for both brands, but it's always a balancing act where we need to look at where would we like to go to have good representation compared to where is there good quality interviewing resources. And they may be quality, but they may not be equipped to do certain kinds of tests. So is there a way to get them equipped, or do we have to go somewhere else? So it's definitely a balancing act.
Okay, good time for a question. It says, can you please give an example of when you would not conduct a controlled central location testing environment? Yes, I can give it. Actually, I can answer that in two ways. One you might not think about. So an example of when you would probably want to do an extended home use test is if you're talking about a beauty product, right? If I'm saying that my beauty product erases fine lines over time, there's really no way to retrofit that to a central location. You probably have to use the product in home for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, however long it takes to erase those fine lines. But I'll give you another example where you might think it's the similar situation, but it's not, and that is if you're making a claim that is related to time, but it's maybe freshness. So if you have a cheese product and you want to say that your cheese remains fresh over time, you know that once you open cheese, you're supposed to keep it for about 5 days and use it within that 5-day window. And so rather than having to put it in home and have people leave it in their refrigerator for 5 days, you can keep the control of a central location test by pre-aging cheese. You can pre-age the cheese. I can open the cheese 5 days before my interviewing. I can open it 3 days before my interviewing, and I can have a fresh package. I can have people try all 3 and confirm that, in fact, it remains fresh over time. So those are, you might revert, you might have thought that would have had to be done at home, but we often try to see if we can fit it into a central location just because it really is the preferred method among those governing bodies because of the control. Okay, so moving on, competitive set. So assuming that you are now looking at substantiating a competitive claim, who you test amongst, or against, excuse me, is a very big decision. If your claim is versus one competitor only, pretty clear, right? If you say we are preferred over the leading brand, and the leading brand is very clearly one brand, or you might name them by name, that's clear. But what if you want to put your claim on multiple flavors or varieties of your product, right? So what if you want to make what we call a line claim? It's only us and one competitor, but if you have several different products in your line and they have comparable products, you would not want to just test one variety. That's the discussion that we would have in terms of what kinds of rules of thumb should we use about how many of your flavors or varieties do you need to test. If you're testing versus multiple competitors, then the discussion becomes, do you need to do a full separate test with a 300 sample size against each of those competitors? Or can you do one cell test where you do each competitor in their proper proportions, or 100 of each competitor? We see that less and less, again, because things are being challenged more and more. But certainly part of the discussion that we have. I kind of touched on this earlier. I got ahead of myself. If your product line includes many SKUs or varieties, then you have to make sure that you are testing a meaningful proportion of the competitively comparable varieties.
So Lisa, now we know what we're going to test, but how the heck are we going to get all that product? So again, there are recognized standards for this. It's impartial. It's not like the client company is providing their product and the other competitor product is picked off the shelf, so on and so forth. Product procurement requires a lot of careful planning, and if I've already said it before, I'll say it a little differently now. All the steps we talked about before take a lot of discussion and thought and multiple calls and so on and so forth. Product procurement might be one of the things that we as a research consulting agency on these tests spend the most time on, because one area that could be challenged is how product was procured, what kind of stores it was taken from, or was it back ordered because there wasn't enough on the shelf? Did you match up product codes as best as possible so you don't have an advantage over them, or vice versa? So it's very important for these details to be discussed. You know, obviously we don't want our field services going out and looking at Walmart if the product's never there. That's a waste of time. Or if formulations are different from store to store, we would need to know that so we can plan and execute appropriately. And most importantly, the product should not be repacked. So if you're doing a comparative situation, it's really important it's in that central location so it can be blinded in some fashion. Now there are other packing considerations to think about. There might be different varieties that you have of a product, different SKUs, packaging formats, and you need to think about, well, which one would we have them taste, you know, from which source. Usually the standard is you're picking the most frequently purchased pack size based on volume, not on dollar sales. The dollars can vary depending on the area of the country and so forth, or the retailer. Now, there could be situations where a pack type could influence the product performance. For example, K-cups of this Swiss Miss, maybe the formulation is different because it's got to be more intense flavor or concentration so that when the water hits this small amount in that machine, it produces the right formula or desired output. So these are all the kinds of things that have to be discussed. And, you know, some of it is discussed on other kinds of tests, benchmarking tests versus competition, but the direction of these discussions goes much further with much more weight on the decisions because of the potential for high-risk states.
Right. So I always say to people that I'm certainly not a lawyer, but I try to put my lawyer cap on when we're having these conversations, and I know you do too, Sue, and say, if I were the opposing lawyer challenging you, how would I try to poke a hole in that? How would I say, you know, you tested this format and you didn't test K-cups, and we all know it's an industry known fact that K-cups are different. So again, just trying to have that hat on of the challenge.
And that, Lisa, if I can just add one more thing, yeah, that speaks to the execution, because the execution of how you're going to show your claim, because let's say you tested it from packets, because that makes sense to do, it's the biggest seller, those individual package sizes. Okay, well, what happens in your ad if you show that along with the K-cups packaging? Consumers are going to walk away thinking that both were substantiated. That would be a definite place to be challenged if, you know, competitor were to think of that and ask about it, for sure. So along with the packaging and all of that, there's also product preparation and handling. So just like, you know, a normal test, there's all kinds of instructions that may be received from R&D or marketing or what have you, and you need to think about following the instructions exactly.
So we're going to pick right up, actually, and we had a question, and it says, for a food example, how do you make the decisions around how to serve the product in terms of carriers? So this is a great question. We have it happen a lot. I'll give you an example using condiments. So do you have people, if you're testing mayonnaise or mustard, do you just give them a cup of mayonnaise or a cup of mustard? The question is, do people typically eat it that way? And the answer is no. Most people that I know don't eat mayo or mustard, although I do have a sister who used to like to eat butter when she was a kid. we won't name her. So we we want to think about that carrier. I think the other thing that we think a lot about is making that carrier as unobtrusive as possible. So if it can be on kind of an unsalted cracker maybe, or a piece of white bread, something that doesn't have its own taste flavor. Again, I'll use mayonnaise as an example. If you want to test mayonnaise in a salad, the most frequently used salad with mayo might be tuna fish. However, tuna fish certainly has its own flavor profile, and a lot of people might not like tuna, so you might go with something that's a little more consumer friendly, like potato salad. Okay, so we kind of started here. We said it's most important that you know what the claim question is before you even begin. We're coming back to it. We're full circle now. The claim question, and we do say question without the S, because this type of research is not designed for diagnostic purposes. It's not for a fishing expedition to see if we can get this claim, or if we can't get this one, can we get that one? The protocol is to ask one claim question as closely related to the claim that you're trying to substantiate as possible. So we ask relevant screening questions, we ask the claim question, we ask key demographics or any other important classification questions, maybe like brand usage, to confirm that your sample is representative in nature, and then we get out. There's an exception to every rule. Sometimes when we work with marketing and legal, often when it's a claim just against ourselves, not a competitive claim, then the players may be willing to let you ask 2 questions. I would just say what I ask in that circumstance is, what are the 2 questions you want to ask? Because if they're similar, if you ask, chocolate taste and taste, for instance, and you get the claim on one of those and you don't get it on the other one, I would put my lawyer hat on and say that I would challenge you, that those are so closely related that if you didn't get this one, I don't think you should be able to use that one. So again, all those to the discussion that we have. So just a little bit here, a couple of slides on what types of tests are required, what's the test design for the different claims. A comparative claim, like we are preferred over our competitor, requires a direct preference test. So the courts and governing bodies don't look favorably on doing a 2-cell monadic test where a group of people tries your product and rates it, and a group of people tries the competitive product and rates it, and then we say, oh, our levels of acceptance are higher than theirs. What they require, because it is really a head-to-head claim, is a head-to-head test. So consumers have to try both products and talk about which they prefer. This is interesting. This is about execution again. So if you embark on a claims test and you pass the hurdle for a competitive claim, you are preferred over your competitor. And say that your brand is preferred by 55% of consumers and the competitor's preferred by 40 or 45% of the consumers. You can certainly say that you are preferred, but you don't want to do what we have here on our visual, which is show almost double the number of people in your line for your brand as in line for the competitive brand. Because that's suggesting, again, we go back to that communication, that what this communicates to me is that, oh my goodness, people prefer our brand 2 to 1. If that's not true, you should not be depicting it. So talking about non-comparative claims, these are actually typically monadic because we're just making a claim about one thing, one product, our product. We're saying our product has this, it has fresh taste, it has a soft texture, etc. And so it's try my product, and do you agree or disagree that it has this attribute? And then we have what we call absolute value claims. So an absolute value typically uses the words no or none or never or all or every. So for instance, if you say that your popcorn leaves no unpopped kernels, then theoretically everyone who we test with should agree that there were no kernels left unpopped. However, we know that in environment, achieving 100% agreement with anything, while theoretically possible and necessary, it may not be obtainable. So there's a rule of thumb, kind of a basement level, if you will, of 75% agreement. But there are, some industries where standards may require a higher threshold. So another point of discussion. Now I'm going to kind of turn it over to Sue.
And we're going to be wrapping up now, and I hope people are still with us on the line.
Looks like it.
Good, great. Sorry about that problem earlier. We want to take a full circle now and just reemphasize the focus on quality. As you can imagine, if there were a legal challenge, there'd be many documents that could be discoverable. In fact, probably all would be, emails and everything. So we want to have focus on quality throughout, be maybe a little more attention to detail in our communications. We're going to have very detailed written instructions to our field services on how to conduct the test. We're going to have continuous communication with the field sites to check in that they're doing things properly, even more than we normally do. And there's going to be a higher level of attempts to do post-validation field work as much as possible beyond what we would normally do.
Yeah, and just to your point about email, Sue, I would say I often, because this is the age of email, right? We communicate, we write everything in emails, we write all of our thoughts. And I kind of ask people if they will give a little bit of, pause for a moment, think about what you want to put in that email, and think about whether it's saying, hey, let's discuss whether we should do A or B. It seems innocuous, but the truth is, if you decide to do A and not B, you don't ever want it to look like you decided to make a choice because it was convenient for you or might put you at an advantage. So I often suggest that maybe we have a quick call first. We talk about whatever the issue is, the decision, and then we can kind of follow up an email so everyone's aligned and say, hey, just want to confirm we are aligned that we're going to go down path B, and here's our rationale.
Exactly, exactly. Doesn't mean the team cannot change course, make a decision or a different decision on how they're going to do it, but we want to hold our cards to our vest a little bit and not outright be discussing it fully in email. So it's just something to think about. And so getting back to talking about the information and records, we're keeping meticulous records even more than we normally do. Things we don't need, we get rid of, as long as we're not, getting rid of something that we should have. But, miscellaneous notes and all those kinds of things we're just getting rid of. We're having all kinds of information from keeping track of what the product codes were used, all kinds of forms, signatures that people were interviewed, and again, above and beyond what we normally do, which is high quality and rigor, but even more so in these cases, because again, you're going to have to prove out if you're challenged that every aspect of your test was buttoned up.
Great. So this is kind of our closing, and that is we just wanted to share with you some of the resources and the governing bodies that manufacturers and research agencies like us look to for help with claims testing. Challenges to claims are often brought to the NAD, the National Advertising Division of the Better Business Bureau. Interestingly, in recent years, the courts have been a little more active. People sometimes either they go to the NAD and don't get the result they want and they escalate it to the courts, or sometimes people go directly to the courts. So it can be brought to the courts. The NAD is something that most advertisers have agreed will be the first line of defense. And again, I just wanted to point out that just remember that some of these governing agencies are actively seeking out claims advertising that they think might warrant a better look, a closer look. So we know we covered a lot of ground today. We hope we've illustrated, again, that it's the simplest, most complicated test you might ever execute. Sue and I are both always available, more than happy to assist you with any initiatives that you have, give you our thoughts. We hope that you'll reach out to us, and if you think of any questions that you haven't asked today, we'd like to hear those as well. So thank you.
And it would be great if you can answer the short survey that's going to be coming to you.
Should come to you right after the webinar.
Fantastic. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate it. Have a great day.
Thank you. Have a great day.